Okay. Okay. So let me just point out, there have been a lot of fears around the 2020 census. It was conducted by the Trump administration, and there is a history in the United States of, if you will, the corruption of the census by certain presidents. And 1890 would be a really good example, where the Republicans had just expanded the country and wanted to make the case for an apportionment that they thought would be favorable to them, and brought a lot of pressure on to the way in which the count occurred. Um, and clearly there was mischief with the 2020 census. And we're now learning some of the details of that mischief, that there was obviously the effort to put the citizenship question on the census. I'm quite proud of the fact that one of my former students was the federal judge who wrote the opinion that said that that was unconstitutional or illegal, and hence that was not allowed. What I didn't realize, what's come to light more recently, is that after that occurred, there were an exceptional number of political appointees put into the Census Bureau by the Trump administration to try to create a count of non-citizens not using the census, and to then use that count to adjust the census figures. In the end, this also didn't work, but there was a lot of internal politicking within the Census Bureau as the 2020 census was being conducted. And then we add to the mix, of course, that this was a pandemic year. And so the machinery involved in conducting the census, having people go door to door, et cetera, was much more difficult. And having said all of that, as we get the data, and it's coming in waves, it does appear that the census was reasonably well conducted, and that some of the fears about, for instance, an undercount of Hispanics or Latinos, because they would have been frightened by the possibility of having the citizenship question put on the census, and the idea that it would be used then to turn them over to ICE or to deport them, that also doesn't appear to have at least substantially distorted the census figures, as far as we can tell from the initial data. So with that by way of background, I want to look at two things: the snapshot that is emerging of the United States from the 2020 census, what we learn about ourselves as a society, and then secondly, the political implications of the census. And this, of course, occurs in the context. We've just finished a long lecture series on partisanship and parties in the United States. And of course, among the things the census contributes to, actually the reason the data that was released on Thursday was released, was to contribute to or guide the reapportionment of congressional districts for the 2022 elections. And to be clear, in order to do that, the states needed both population data that determines which states gain and which states lose, and which areas gain and lose, representation as population shifts between and within states. And they also needed racial demographic information, because there is federal statutory limits on what can be done in terms of race and reapportionment. We have to be clear that the racial composition of the congressional districts neither dilutes nor compresses minority votes in ways that would be unconstitutional or illegal. And so I'm going to just return your memory for a moment to the diagram from Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, which I imagine you see in your dreams at this point, right? I've talked about it a lot. And this diagram again shows that the constituency that supports the Democratic Party in the United States today looks an awful lot like the demographics of the United States. And please note that the most recent census shows that the United States is 58% white, and therefore, right, roughly 42% people of color. There's some question about how much that transformation, which makes us considerably more diverse than we were 10 years ago, is a reflection of differential birth rates or the differential composition of the population, and how much of it is due to the fact that people chose to check different buttons than they checked a decade ago, that more people are attracted to the idea of checking the multiracial option now, and that's one of the fastest growing categories, especially for people under 30. But basically, the people who vote Democratic mirror the demographics of the United States, whereas the people who vote Republican look the way the United States looked maybe 60 years ago, which is to say they're 90% white. And this, of course, is in the background to all of this. Now, I'm actually sorry, I'm not going to talk about this. I want to talk about this. This is a diagram that I know makes it look like the United States needs a shave. But the basic idea here is that if you take each census tract, and as you can see, there are thousands of them, and there are more of them in the more populous states, and so they're concentrated on the seaboards and especially in the east. And you measure how much did the population increase and how much did it increase proportionately in terms of the share of people of color or the share of the white population, and you color, right, the increase in people of color with blue arrows, and the length of the arrow indicates the degree of increase. So where the arrows are longer, that's more of an increase. Where they're shorter, that's less of an increase. Or alternatively, did the share of the white population increase? And what you can see is, with a few exceptions, almost everywhere in the United States became more diverse over the last decade. And by the way, that obviously is reflected in the coastal and urban areas. But please note, it's true for Wyoming, it's true for Montana, it's true for Idaho and Utah. By the way, Georgia has just become, if not majority minority, no majority, right? It's basically 50-50 in Georgia. If there was any undercount of Latinos, then Georgia is actually majority minority. So the first thing to notice is that this is happening, and it's probably happening more quickly than we anticipated, that the United States is becoming a genuinely multiracial democracy. We are diversifying, and we are diversifying everywhere in the country, more in the urban areas, but that doesn't exempt the less populous, the more rural areas. The states are all becoming more diverse. This is then what we actually see, and please note that, right, this is very similar to a diagram we discussed a few weeks ago when we were looking at Ezra Klein's diagram about the growing diversity within the Democratic Party and the stable homogeneity within the Republican Party, we compared it with the overall demographics. Now that was a diagram prepared by the Pew Foundation in 2015, so that the figure for 2020 was a projection. I've done the comparison. We are more diverse in 2020 than the Census Bureau and Pew had predicted we would be. We are diversifying more quickly. And that is almost exclusively because of growth in the Hispanic or Latinx proportion of the demographic. Actually, the Asian proportion is a little smaller than we anticipated it would be relative to the overall population. And so this then again lets us see what the nation is becoming and how it's breaking down. This is, as I say, about 58% white, about 13% Black, about 24% Latino, about 13 to 14% Asian. And the diagram doesn't make it look that way. I'm wondering if either I'm misremembering my numbers or misreading the diagram. It certainly looks like there are more African Americans than Asians in the United States today, according to the width or breadth of those bands. Now, let me focus on urban areas. And by the way, the United States is becoming more and more urban. And so one of the things we are seeing is that the population shift from the rural areas to the urban areas continues. All 10 of America's largest cities now have over 1 million people in them. That's the first time that's happened. We're very much now an urban society. That's where the vast majority of our population lives. When I say that, that doesn't mean they live in the city center necessarily. As you're familiar with in the Bay Area, we have the city, and then we have concentric rings moving out from the cities of urban, suburban, exurban, and more the population is moving to one of those three rings, but increasingly they're moving closer into the urban area. And so this makes us a society with higher population density. It also makes us a society with greater diversity and contact between the diverse groups. And so if you look at, these are 6 cities that in 2010 were majority white, that in 2020 are now minority white or majority people of color, right? And so you see, and it's not necessarily the cities you would expect: Dallas, Atlanta, Orlando, Sacramento, New Orleans, Austin, right? They're different cities. There's a preponderance of southern cities that are diversifying here. We'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But I want to remind you a little bit here of an experiment done by Ryan Enos of Harvard University. And this is the experiment where he put a couple of Mexican Americans on trains in Boston, right? The trains were actually coming from the suburbs, very white communities, and going into Boston, and he put them on the same train. I think it was the 733 train or something like that. And it turns out most of the people who ride that train ride the same train every day. And so he was able to compare the 733 with the 747, where he didn't give the 747 the treatment. He didn't put Latino people speaking Spanish on their train. And then he surveyed them in 2016, and he found that the train that had a artificial infusion of diversity, people who looked Latino speaking Spanish, just a couple of them, remember, the support for Trump jumped as soon as those people started riding the train. The support for harsh anti-immigrant policy went way up, and that on the other trains that stuff didn't increase at all. So it seems to be pretty clear that it was the infusion of diversity that was driving the reactionary anti-immigrant politics on the people on that train. That's the first thing to notice, right? Introduce diversity into an area that had not been very diverse, and you often get a reaction of fear, hostility, intolerance. The second thing, and I think this is less reported, but it's worthwhile remembering, is that he did this experiment over a couple months. And as time went by, actually, the hostility to diversity diminished. And the people on the train didn't quite go back exactly where they were, but they did return to being much less pro-Trump, much more pro-immigrant. And by the way, this is a liberal suburb of Boston, so they were not inclined to support Trump or to be harshly anti-immigrant until Ryan Enos injected diversity into their midst. And so this speaks to what's sometimes called the contact hypothesis. It goes back to the very early days of American social psychology, and the idea that if you have the right kind of contact, and by the way, the right kind of contact is not just seeing somebody on the same train with you, it is actually having a conversation with them, actually being in a social setting where perhaps you have a chance to get to know them a little bit. That your hostility will diminish. They become less the other, less a stranger, and you begin to recognize that differences in skin color and language use notwithstanding, you actually have something in common with them. And I think we can anticipate that as Americans move more and more to the cities, as our cities become more and more diverse, as let us hope, because right, Ryan Enos shows that we are still quite segregated, but as at least there is more contact in the workplace, in public spaces, etc., that we may in fact become more cosmopolitan, more inclusive, more tolerant, and that this may drive then a reconfiguration of racial attitudes, particularly, let us hope, a diminished white hostility to the diversification of America, the kinds of politics that drove the ascendancy of Donald Trump in 2016 and still makes him the dominant figure in the Republican Party today. All right, so with that general picture in mind, I now want to start talking about what the census does to us politically. And I want to be clear, the reason the census data was shared on the 12th of August was to allow the states to begin to reapportion, right? And that in the United States today, reapportionment, the drawing of district lines, and please note, I can show you very quickly, right? These are the states that lost and the states that won. As you may be aware, California, for the first time in its history, is losing a congressional district. New York, where I am, got within 89 people on the census from being able to keep its current number of representatives. We fell less than 100 people short, but we're losing one. North Carolina, Florida, Texas are all gaining. Between them, they're gaining 4. Montana is gaining 1. And here I think it's worthwhile noting that the vast majority of gains are going to red states, and that these are all states that engage in so-called partisan districting, right? And this marks an ongoing population shift away from the Midwest and the Northeast to the West and the South. And it's worthwhile noting that the West that's gaining is no longer California, but Oregon and Colorado, right? So there's a shift within the regions as well as a shift between regions. But that North Carolina, Florida, Texas, and Montana all have partisan processes for redistricting, and they are all controlled by Republicans. And the likelihood is, therefore, that just because of redistricting, not because of any other kind of electoral dynamic, the Republicans will gain 5 seats in the House of Representatives in 2022. And please note, that's enough to give them a majority right there. Now, when I speak of partisan districting, I want to illustrate this to be clear, right? And this is not quite the composition of the country. This is supposed to be red and blue. It looks more like adobe and purple, I know. But the basic idea is, if you have a population, and let's say each one of these boxes represents 10,000 people, right? You could divide it in multiple different ways. So these are where those people live. You could draw stripes so that you had 3 districts that were 100% blue people and 2 districts that were 100% red people. And because the breakdown in population is 60% blue, 40% red, you get perfect representation, which is to say the number of representatives for blue perfectly matches their proportion of the population, and the same thing holds for red. You could also create districts that are, quote, compact. That is to say that they're just straight lines. They're drawn to be good rectangles, right? But very unfair, right? Unfair in the sense that although the red represent 40% of the population, they get 0% of the representation. And then with a little bit of ingenuity, right, you can draw lines that are not compact and unfair, right? And the reason this is unfair is because you have diluted the blue people, right? You have packed them in to 2 big districts where almost all of them are. And so they win 2 districts, but then you've put a bunch of them in districts that are majority red. By drawing the lines in the right places, you end up with a situation where 40% of the population gets 60% of the representation and 60% gets 40%, right? And when we speak of partisan districting, we're talking about the effort to draw lines that look like number 3, essentially, that do their very best to distort the outcomes. There are different examples of this. I think North Carolina is the clearest recent example. North Carolina in 2018, the state split 50-50. 50% of the population voted for Republicans, 50% voted for Democrats. Their congressional delegation, if I remember correctly, is 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, right? So in a sense, it's even worse than this. Now, how is this done? I think part of what we need to remember is that the diverse, and let's be ideological about this as well, more liberal, more likely to vote Democratic people are moving into the cities. And so in a sense, they're self-segregating. And so if you just draw lines on the map that put all those people where they are, then you're more likely to get districts, as you have in many places in the country, that are 60, 70, 80% Democratic. And so although you're getting 80% of the vote for a Democrat, you're still only getting 1 representative, right? Whereas if there are other districts that are 45% Democratic and 55% Republican. That's a reliably Republican district, but not that huge margin, right? And so part of this is the geographic self-segregation of more diverse, more liberal people in the United States in urban centers makes it easier. It's a kind of natural gerrymander. And then we add to that the idea that with big data, with the ability to predict more and more precisely based on the data trails that we leave online from the devices that we're using all the time, how people are going to vote, right? And this has become very precise, very scientific. You see what websites people view, what social media sources they like and dislike. You very quickly can determine how they're going to vote with a great deal of precision. And you can figure out block by block, even increasingly house by house, what the partisan composition of each geographic area is, and figure out where to draw your line so as to maximize the partisan advantage. If you think about it, it's quite astounding what we see in Pennsylvania and North Carolina and other places that have engaged in aggressive partisan districting, where you're able to so decisively skew the representation. This speaks to the new technology that is at stake here. So what we can expect as, and there are two things happening here, I think it's worthwhile noting. There is the distribution between the states. As North Carolina, Florida, Texas, and Montana redistrict to take into account the fact that they're gaining, as for instance, Ohio redistricts, another red state with Republicans in control of the state legislature and the governorship, they will redraw their lines to take away a Democratic representative, right? And so this will, in and of itself, further tilt the playing field in American politics. And when I say the playing field is tilted, let me show you exactly how tilted it is. And this is then a diagram that shows you blue states and red states, and the lighter colors are the amount of votes, and the darker colors are the amount of representatives. And as you can see, Democrats engage in partisan gerrymandering too, or to maybe put it a little bit less tendentiously, there is a tendency for over-representation of Democratic voters in Democratic states and over-representation of Republican voters in Republican states. If that tendency were equal, you might say, well, this all comes out in the wash, right? But the tendency is not equal. And so to be clear, right, in blue states, there's about a 9% overrepresentation. That is to say, 60% vote for Democrats and 69% of the representatives are Democrats. Or to put it differently, there's about a 9% underrepresentation of Republicans in blue states. But when we get to red states, the overrepresentation of Republicans is about 14 to 15%, and the underrepresentation of Democrats is 14 to 15%. And that might not sound huge, but once you account for this mathematically, that means that there are about 11 more Democratic members of Congress than there would be if this were perfect representation. Each vote has an equal impact and equal representation.
11 more Democrats or 11 more Republicans?
11 more Democrats and 34 more Republicans.
I'm sorry. Okay, good.
Yeah, and so once we subtract, there are about 23 more Republicans than there would be if we had fair representation. And that's probably about to go up to around 28. And so the House of Representatives is not representative. This is an issue, this is a problem, and please let me now underline the bad news, right? The good news in the census is that we're becoming more diverse, we're becoming more urban. If Ryan Enos and the contact hypothesis is right, we will be becoming more tolerant, more inclusive, more equitable, let us hope. The bad news is that when a Trump supporter, especially the kind of person who chants in Charlottesville almost 4 years ago to the day, "You will not replace us," sees this map, this frightens them. This suggests to them that this country is moving even more quickly than they thought in the direction of being a country where the historical privilege associated with white skin is slowly but surely being eroded, and that this threatens the status, the sense of power, the sense of belonging of these people, and they are going to be increasingly desperate to figure out ways to do this, right? To make sure that they preserve their power. And so the likelihood is, as they reapportion, that they will further enhance the relative power of Republicans. Now, as I continue with this, I just want to point out to you the implication of this. And by the way, there's another issue with all of this, and that has to do with the Senate. And as you know, representation in the Senate is highly disproportionate. 2 persons per state, irrespective of the population of the states. What we are seeing, and again, I'm sorry for jumping around so much, but I think it shows here, right? When we look at the less populous states in the United States, there just wasn't a lot of population growth. When we look at the more populous states, there was more population growth. We're becoming a more urban society, but we're also becoming a society in which the less populous states are even less populous relative to the more populous states. So when we get to the Senate, then this means a further amplification of the power of the less populous and frankly, whiter and more conservative older states. And we combine that, right, with what happens with the House of Representatives. I'll get into this in just a moment, but I'll just point out to you that the current average population for a House district is 730,000 people. The population of Wyoming is 539,000 people. Wyoming, by the Constitution's dictate, gets a representative in the House of Representatives. Every state gets at least 1 representative. And so Wyoming is punching above its weight in Congress because the average is 730. Many of those districts actually have 740. It has 540 and it still gets 1 representative. And this translates, combined with the Senate, into a real skew in the electoral college. And please note, right, what this diagram shows is as the Republicans get 47, 48, 49% of the vote, they become very likely to win the election. And that as they get up to 50% of the vote, their chance of winning a presidential election goes up to almost 75%, right? So there are scenarios in which the Republicans can win the election by getting 43% of the vote if it shakes out just right. And basically for the Democrats to safely win a presidential election, they need to get between 53 and 54% of the popular vote. So this skews not only the House and the Senate, but also presidential politics in the United States. And so the question then is what we can do about this. And I'm going to return to a different proposal. Some of the proposals that we've looked at in the past include bypassing the Electoral College, right? And so the interstate popular vote compact, or moving over to single member districts for congressional representation. I'm sorry, multi-member districts for congressional representation, eliminating partisan gerrymandering, and making districting nonpartisan. These are all good proposals, but I think there's another thing that really we should be thinking about. And that is the fact that the number of representatives in the House of Representatives increased more or less proportionately with the population from 1789 consistently until 1914. And that since then, it has been stuck at 435, right? It's been a little bit of movement, but essentially it's stuck at 435. And there's a question. Why is it stuck at 435? And the answer is there in the congressional record. If you look at the last time Congress increased the representation in the Senate, it was in the aftermath of the 1910 census. I said in the Senate, I mean in the House of Representatives. It was after the 1910 census. And that census showed that the population of the United States was becoming increasingly urban, increasingly immigrant, larger numbers of African Americans, and a large number of the then representatives in Congress did not want Congress to shift to reflect the demographics of the country. And fixing the number of House seats was one way to do that, because especially in 1910, when the population was around 110 million, right? So we have 3 times the population in the country today and the same number of seats in the House. This meant that the less populous states would have much greater representation. And then, as now, those states were wider, more Protestant, older, more conservative. And so the fixing of the House at 435 was a deliberate effort to push against the demographic tide and its political implications in 1913. And 110 years later, almost, although we have changed in so many ways, our population has tripled, new states have been added, we have seen so much more urbanization, here we are still at 435. So let me show you a simple proposal. This is sometimes called the Wyoming proposal, right? The Wyoming, as I said, population is 539,000. One way to do this would be to say the average congressional district should be the size of the smallest state. And then we go back to having essentially a principle of one person, one vote actually govern the way in which we are represented in the House of Representatives, right? And look, if we were just basically to say right now there are 180 safe Republican seats, 159 safe Democratic seats. Again, this has a little bit to do, or more than a little bit to do, with gerrymandering. If we were to say that, many of those safe seats are going to remain safe seats, but many of the new seats that are going to be created will be genuinely contested seats. And please note, what this would mean if we lowered the size of congressional districts to around 540,000 is that California would get another 20 members of Congress. Texas would get another 11 members of Congress, I believe. And so, right, both a red state and a blue state would expand their representation, but we could do it in a way, if we did it in a nonpartisan way, so that more of those districts would be toss-up districts. This would have multiple effects, among them that the more populous states would get more representation in the Congress and in the Electoral College. And so we would return to an idea of greater proportionality, that we could begin to break up some of those urban areas and make them a little bit more representative and a little bit more contested. And so this shows different ways of districting, and the way in which expanding congressional districts in Denver could greatly increase the number of districts that are toss-up districts, how expanding the number of districts in the Phoenix area, it's really Arizona as a whole, could result in increased representation of Republicans, whereas expanding Iowa might result in increased Democratic representatives. And the last thing I want you to see here, because I think there may be a tendency to say, isn't 435 pretty large already? And I would just say, if you look, right, the United States is an outlier, right? We have roughly the same number in our legislature as places like Turkey, Mexico, Japan, Poland, which are much smaller countries, right? And that there are places like the UK that are literally a sixth the size of the United States and have 50% more members in their lower chamber in the right in Parliament. And so this is not unworkable. This does not result in paralysis, but it does increase both responsiveness, because now you have fewer constituents for each representative, and it also would counteract some of the skew in representation in the United States today. And so as we think about the census, as we think about the demographic changes that it's resulting in, I think it's time to begin thinking about, is it the case that we should just view as fixed two really important pieces of the American political landscape right now? One of them is the number of people in the House of Representatives. The other is that redistricting is, especially in red states, simply an exercise in partisan power, right? And the what should guide the redistricting process is not trying to make your districts as competitive or as responsive as possible, but simply maximizing your party's strategic advantage as a result. Let me stop there for a moment and see if you guys have questions. I'm willing to bet you do, either about the demographics and what they reveal about the direction of the country, or about the redistricting process that's about to get underway. We could talk a little bit, if you want, about the Voting Rights Act and the way in which the Holder v. Shelby decision has removed the requirement for pre-clearance on the part of the states, so that it makes it much more easy for states to bring about partisan redistricting. They don't have to have it approved by the Justice Department first, and makes it much more likely that 2022, whatever the states do, will be the way in which we vote. If those districts are going to be challenged in the courts, it probably won't wend its way through the courts until the middle of this decade. Anybody want to start us out? That's unusual. It's not often the case that I don't have a question. I bet there's something percolating out there. Who are you surprised to see the results of this census? I will tell you that many demographers were surprised that this is actually an acceleration of the diversification of the United States relative to what was anticipated, especially with regards to the Hispanic or Latino proportion of the population, and that it is, in a sense, reassuring that we got this picture despite the worry that there was shenanigans and intimidation, or that the pandemic would interrupt it. Bob, you put your hand up, right?
Yeah. Okay, it's encouraging that the trends seem to be more diversification. However, in the current situations, the Republicans seem to hold much of the power, and they're not going to release it or relinquish it. So it seems like we're going to go in the Republican direction for the next decade at least, unless we can get some of these other things passed. But how do you get them passed given the current composition of the Congress, of the gerrymandering, the state legislatures, everything?
Yes. So let me say a couple things in response to Bob's comment. And in a sense, you could say that maybe the findings of this census are deeply ambivalent, that the country is moving in a direction that long-term favors the Democrats, at least as long as the Democrats continue to be successful in assembling a multiracial coalition to support them, and as long as the Republicans continue to fail to do that, right? But let's please note, the country is now, 54, 57% white. The electorate is still almost 2/3 white, right? And some of that reflects the fact that some of the new diversity is from young people who are still too young to vote. Some of it reflects the fact that some of the diversity is from non-citizens who don't have the right to vote, right? And so this doesn't immediately translate into an entirely new electorate. That may take another decade. And it seems, if you're playing the long game, that these trends favor the Democrats. But I think Bob is absolutely right that in the short term, the redistricting, the fact that the Republicans are much more aggressive in engaging in partisan redistricting, that many Democratic states have shifted over to nonpartisan districting, and where the population shifts are occurring, all of that favors the Republicans in the short term. So that seems exactly right to me. Then your question is, how do we reform, right? If this is a problem, how do we reform? And let me start with just a quick observation. One of the things that we see from this census is that we're moving very quickly in the direction. We're not quite there yet, but we're almost there yet. Almost there now, where 50% of the population has 8 senators, right? Think about that for a moment. 4 states have almost 50% of the population of the United States in them. And those 4 states get the same representation as the 4 least populous states, which when you put it all together, they have less population, less than a quarter of the population of the most populous state, right? How long, and please note, right, a couple of those states are blue states, a couple of those states are red states. How long do the most populous states say it's okay that we have so little representation, right? So
Alert from Google password required.
I see.
Alert from.
So all that to say, there might be some demographic aspects of this that push in the direction of reform, irrespective of partisanship. But I do think you're basically right that unless there's an epiphany that occurs simultaneously for Joe Manchin and Kristen Seneca, and they both decide, wait, on voting rights, this is too important, and we've got to suspend the filibuster, at least on this issue. These reform proposals are mainly dead in the water unless they appear to be nonpartisan or bipartisan. That's one of the things about expanding the House of Representatives that seems to me attractive at this juncture. John, did you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks. This actually isn't directly relevant to what you're talking about, but the enormous trend toward diversity, the measure that you were using is the usual one we use, which is the percent of the white, non-Hispanic white population, which politically is the most relevant thing. But there's a very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal this morning that uses a different measure of diversity, which is the chance within a given state, the chances that the guy living next door to you or somebody that you encounter is of a different race or ethnic background. And that's been an enormous increase in diversity. But one interesting thing is it's almost entirely driven by immigration, which isn't like directly relevant to the way voting patterns go, but in our daily lives, it's very important. And the other interesting thing is that the pattern of diversification, I doubt that you can see this map, but here it is. The blue and the 1 or 2 reds, but the blue are all the rapidly diversifying places, and the gray are either not diversifying or becoming less diverse. And it's the entire north half of the United States, all the way from New England, a little bit into the Pacific Northwest, which is becoming more and more diverse, and the South, not at all. I have no idea what the implications of that is, but it's one of the more interesting little pieces of census statistics that I've seen.
Yeah, and so I have to admit, I haven't looked at the Wall Street Journal analysis of this right now or yet. And so let me first ask about that image you just held up. Is that using the metric of diversity you just mentioned? I.e., how likely are you to live cheek by jowl with somebody of a different race? Is that what that is? I can see the image well, John, and thank you, but I'm asking you a question about it. Are you hearing me?
I'm sorry, I muted myself again. Yeah, the question is, are they using that metric? Yes, they are using exactly that metric, and that's the interesting point. The diversity map is totally different than the one using the conventional metric. Again, I have no idea what the implications of that are.
Well, I think we can begin to think through the implications. And so it's interesting then, California is as segregated as Texas or Mississippi using that metric, right? And so this is a metric that looks at residential segregation, I'm going to assume.
No, it's not residential segregation. The unit of analysis is the county, and within the county, then you just mathematically figure if you've got 30% white, 20%. So it's not that at all. But and it's not a measure of what the status quo is. The measure is the change. So the point of it, this is too complicated to get in here. I shouldn't have gotten into it, but the point of interest is that the northern half of the US is getting more diverse in the sense that the chances that you're living next door to somebody who's different than you are is greater, while the southern half is static. But it's a change measure. It's not a measure of the degree of integration. It's the degree of change in integration. Again, I'm sort of sorry I brought it up, but it is a really interesting thought.
Actually really important, John, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because I was speaking earlier about Ryan Enos's work and about the idea of the contact hypothesis, right? So that it's not just diversity as like an overall demographic trend that matters. It's whether or not, as a result of the greater diversity, the majority population is likely to have social contact with the new forms of diversity that, if you will, demystify, right, those people, right, who may seem foreign, who may seem other, who may seem hostile, and then you get to know them and it turns out they're an awful lot like you, right? And so it makes it much more difficult to demonize them. And so, yes, that seems to me to be a very relevant metric. And I do want to point out, maybe we'll return to this at a later date, the census data that we have is still incomplete, right? You know, this data was accelerated and distributed before the Census Bureau could do all of its other analysis, because they knew the states were waiting on it to be able to redistrict, and because we have an election coming up in 2022, which means we have primaries coming up in less than a year, right? And so they had to get this data out. I think pretty soon, I don't know how soon, we're going to get track by track data that's going to help us to get a little bit more of a picture of what life on the ground, the lived experience of America in 2020 is like, and how it differs from America in 2010. Ryan Enos, who focuses primarily on Black-white segregation, points out that in most places in the United States today, we are more segregated residentially than the segregated South was during the Jim Crow era, right? And he uses Chicago as an example of that. I wonder whether, if we focus on Latino or Asian or new immigrant contact, we would get a different picture than focusing on Black-white. That seems to be what you're showing me suggests. John, did you want to follow up? You're still muted.
No, only to mention that the depressing fact is that American public schools are considerably more segregated now than they were before Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah, and as we know, that's in response to Brown v. Board, right? So it's one of the tricky things about using law to try to produce social change is there are sometimes unintended consequences if the population, the people in your society, don't want to go the direction that the law is trying to push them to go. All right, everyone. Food for thought, I hope. Good as always being with you. I will be in touch with Genevieve soon to let you know whether we're doing this in person next week or we're doing another Zoom session. As soon as it's safe, as soon as it makes sense, I'm going to come to California again and get to be in the same room with you all. I hope that's next week, but we've got to be sure that it makes sense. Take care, everyone. Have good weeks. Fun.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Genevieve. Take care everywhere, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.